Hi everyone, my name is Katia Vasquez and I am an English 220, which is literature and film. And for my final project, I decided to read the book and watch the film called One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest. The book was made by Ken Kesey in 1962, and the film, which is also called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was directed by Milos Forman in 1975. Ken Kesey made this book in 1962, which was also the 1960s, which this was one of the most important times in America, I would have to say, because this is when the civil rights movement was starting. It was created. It was starting. The government was taking control of people. For instance, Kesey really explained this into his book because they took more things and the government took more control over people in the mental hospital, mental institution, psychiatric ward, whatever you want to call it. But one of the things that we have to also think about is how was the mental institution or psychiatric ward like in 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s compared to the 21st century, 2000s, 2010, 2020, 2021. And this really wasn't your typical psychiatric ward because it may be in the 1960s, but many of the people really, patients weren't really watched as much as they should be. Well, definitely in most people in the 2000s, 2021, 2020, was more watched and more being treated rather than in the 1960s, because in the 1960s they did get the help that they needed, but they weren't watched as most, and the government really sort of abused, and the nurses also sort of abused the patients because they weren't being treated properly and they weren't being treated the way that they were supposed to. And technically it was kind of not really the greatest thing back in the day, but as you know, this is when the civil rights happened, all this, all that. But one of the key points that Ken Kesey really tried to make was that Nurse Ratched, which is one of the main nurses in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, both novel and book, film, and she was portrayed as a very mean, strict nurse, and most of the patients couldn't really stand up to her because they were afraid of her, because Nurse Ratched went pretty much by the government, was strict, mean, didn't really do anything with, she didn't really want to, help all of them, and thought that they weren't really, needed of treatment, more that they needed to be in, just be to get help so they're not alone, because one of the things that she said was that, you need to stay in the hospital in order to be okay with everything. To be okay with yourself, to not be alone. But one of the other main persons was also called Randall McMurphy, which everybody called him Mac because it was his nickname and everybody called him Mac instead of Murphy, except for Nurse Ratched. Nurse Ratched called him Mr. McMurphy, which is understandable. He technically put himself in the mental institution because he did not want to do farm work anymore because he was charged with sexual assault, battery charges, etc. But in the beginning, he was technically not mentally ill, and he really wasn't diagnosed with anything until the middle of the book and the film, because But once he was diagnosed with personality disorder and bipolar. As in the film, and even in the book, but it's more showed in the film that one of the people was like one of the like big people in like the mental institution was like, he's not crazy, but he's dangerous because he did manage to escape multiple times. There was even times he brought pretty much all of the patients with him. They went on a fishing trip without anybody. He also rebels a lot, which in the film, Randall McMurphy was played by Jack Nicholson, which I'm doing a little thing different. I'm showing pictures instead of doing a PowerPoint. But this is him in the film. As you can see, he was crazy, kind of not crazy. But this is him in the film, which he was one of the major people. And Nurse Ratched was played by Louise Fletcher, which this is Nurse Ratched. As you can see, she's crazy. She's mental. You think she's mental, but she's not. I mean, even in this picture, she looks like she should be the one in the mental institution. But she's the nurse, which everybody couldn't really have the intentions to stand up to him. Well, not him, but stand up to Nurse Ratched, which Randall Mack, he had the courage to help everyone to stand up against Nurse Ratched. Randall also started having a friendship with Chief, which was played by Will Sampson. Chief is also one of the main characters. Here's Chief. He was in the mental institution for because he had schizophrenia, which means that you hear voices in your head and you like pretty much do what you like tell them, or like you hear them and pretty much hear them all the time. He also was a selective hearing, sort of, by choice, because he somehow managed to tell everybody that he was deaf because he never answered anybody, which I thought was pretty, it really showed that he was able to, Ken Kesey really made it, like, I think he did a good job with putting that he was schizophrenic and, like, thinking, like, he was deaf and stuff to people, but, I thought it was really good, but, however, the film is completely different than the book, because in the book, Ken Kesey had, Chief, be the storyteller. In the book, he mainly he's the storyteller in the book, saying what the relationship was between Randall and Nurse Ratched, how he saw things. But in the film, he's not the storyteller. You barely see him in the film. He didn't make a huge appearance in the film until they were together, and he and Randall Mack offered Chief piece of juicy fruit, piece of gum, and he was like, juicy fruit? And that's the first time you ever hear him talking. Which I thought that was very, 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 very different. But also, in the book, they talked more about pretty much the government, would punish more, the government, technically, if you think about it, the government had a lot of control over over the patients, the mental, like, had control over the mental institution, which had more control over the patients. And Mac, sorry, Mac had, for instance, Mac rebelled a lot, and the government pretty much said give him shock therapy, which shock therapy wasn't really a good idea, because literally what they did was they put, like, they make you bite something, and then they put shock, and they go shock, and you're shocked, and it pretty much almost gives you a seizure, which this is how Randall ended up in the end of the film and the book. He just was, like, pretty much a vegetable, because he was so, like, pretty much almost brain damaged because of all the shock therapy. Which let's get the better picture. He actually made friends with Billy, which was played by Brad Dourif, which he has a stutter. He was in the hospital because he has a stutter, and because he was mentally ill. And he had pretty much, well, he didn't really have a close relationship with Nurse Ratched, but they kind of, Nurse Ratched knew Billy's mom, and Billy in the book and in the film slept with a woman that got to be able to go in the mental institution, and she found out and was like, oh, do I have to tell your mom? Because in the book, he had a very, very strong relationship with his mom. Which was very, very bad. Also, one of the first people that stood up to Nurse Ratched in the film and in the book, mainly in the book, was Martini, played by Danny DeVito, which this is Martini, Mr. Martini. He was one of the first people that listened to Randall and finally stood up to Nurse Ratched because he wanted a cigarette, because they were allowed to have cigarettes back in the day. Especially, that's one of the things, if you think about it, going back to what I said earlier, the differences between the institutions now, back from the institutions back then, was you could smoke. Back then you can smoke cigarettes, even in the hospital. But now you can't. You're not allowed to have any cigarettes. Nothing. Nada. This, that. Everything. And in Nurse Ratched that was one of the things that you saw Nurse Ratched really tell that he was more that's when Nurse Ratched started showing out her, like, meanness and, like, you know, sit down, you need to listen, you guys rebelled, so you don't get your cigarette privileges are taken away or whatever, which that's pretty much the government talking right there. Also, one of the big things and the differences between the film and the book was the pages in the end of the book. The setting is in the mental institution. It was in the middle of the night when nurses brought Randall back from his last shock therapy, which this is how he ended up, pretty much as a vegetable. Chief was awake, which Chief was very, in the book, which was page 322, he said the big, hard body had a tough grip on life, because Mac was really big into everything, and he was like, he's a rebel. But he pretty much knew that he was going to have a better life if he was just dead. So one of the things that he said was, I had to finally lie full length on top of it and scissor the kicking legs, which meaning Randall was struggling, and pretty much meaning it as Randall lay on top, have a pillow, lay on top of the pillow. And then one of the other things was that Chief also said I had to take my thumbs to push the lids down to have them stay. And then he laid back in his bed. Here, Chief in the book, Chief literally just suffocated Randall, but went back to bed as if nothing happened. Literally nothing happened, which was very different, very not normal. But one of the other things that was very different in the book was he killed Murphy, but but after he killed Murphy, he never shut his eyes, which was very different. This, you can tell, this was definitely not a close adaptation. This was more of an not a close adaptation. And after instead of laying down like he did, and that was mentioned in the book, he got up and he got up and got like the sprayer table thing in the tub room and threw it in the window and jumped out and ran off. In the book, the ending was very different, because they said that in the book he ran off. People started waking up before he jumped out of the window, and then after that, Chief ran out of the jumped out of the window that he broke, ran to the highway, hitched a ride from a Mexican man, explained in the book, Mexican man, the man gave him a jacket and some money because he was on his way to Canada to, pretty much get away from the mental institution as far as he could. But in the film, you don't see that. In the film, after he killed Murphy, he hurried up, went to the tub room, grabbed the thing, jumped out, threw the thing in the window, jumped out, and just ran into the field, and then it just fades to black. You don't see the ending as the book says. But all of the film reviews and coming back to like the film reviews, even though I haven't really talked about them, coming back to the film reviews, and the book reviews, they more explain about the government, the government, how they controlled the people, the patients, talked more about the psychiatric part, which was really good. And one of the things that they said that I really liked was the one film talks about what the meaning of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest meant, which I thought was a really good thing, that they explained. For example, they say cuckoo is slang for crazy, which shows mentally ill, and the word cuckoo is in the title. One goes one way, one goes in the opposite direction, one flies over the nest, but the whole implication is that whoever's in the cuckoo's nest is not nourished, which pretty much means that everything you need to know is cuckoo is mental, cuckoo, crazy. One goes one way, one goes the other. Depending on what your mental illness is, you're the one that chooses how you want to have your treatment, how you continue your treatment. But overall, it's definitely the film. The title is really good. The title pretty much explains everything that you're going to know in the film. Well, in the film and the book. But overall, I believe that the book is completely better than the film, as you can tell, because they changed a lot of things, such as scenes and sayings in the film rather than in the book, which shouldn't have happened because some of this was very bad. But other than that, this definitely was not a close adaptation at all. I can't say that word, sorry about that. But bringing back to what I said, film, the mental institution was completely different, controlled by the government back in the 60s to now, which it's more controlled by the nurses, the psychiatrics, psychologists, more focused on them than anybody else. But that's the film I decided to do. So, back, this is Martini, Danny DeVito. This is how he died. This is how Randall died in the end. Well, he suffocated. This is Billy. Nurse Ratchet. Chief. And Randall. So, hope you liked it. I definitely recommend this book though.